And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Chancellor for WGU Nevada, Spencer Stewart.
Danica, thanks so much for the introduction and providing the ground rules for this webinar. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I hope I'm coming in clearly.
Yes, you sound great.
Wonderful. Thanks, Danica. So I thought what we could do is talk a little bit about balancing work and continuing education. And this really is from the perspective of employers, specifically managers within small, mid-size, and large companies. I'm not quite sure of those of you that are attending where you fall within your organization. If we get to a point where that perspective needs to shift from manager to employee, we certainly can do that towards the end, and we can take those questions during the Q&A period afterwards. I know this is a 30-minute window or webinar, and in my remarks, I'd like to really spend the bulk of the time with Q&A. I have always found that to be a much more enriching exercise rather than having someone like me stand and deliver content. So having said that, Danica, why don't we jump to the first slide? And this is something that we all face, some of us on a daily basis. It's finding and retaining really great talent. And for many of us, we struggle with this, but the struggle is nationally and to some extent globally. So the first point is from Gallup. This is in 2012. It's that 30% of employees in the U.S. and just 13% of employees outside the U.S. feel engaged with their companies. Unemployment is low across the country, and that's a really good metric, but when we start unpacking that, it's figuring out who has or feels that they have a really, really great job, who is engaged. And the percentages are less than what we would think. And the other thing to also consider is that with most organizations, with most companies, managers feel that the employees that have the highest flight risk are those that are least productive, those that are least engaged. But what's interesting is with recent research, it's not so much the employees that are least engaged and less productive. It really are your employees that are talented, highly talented, but perhaps have a low level of engagement. And so the question for all of us moving forward is, how do we shift high talent, low engagement employees to high talent, high engagement? And it's easier said than done. But if we keep a few things in mind, I think we'll be more successful. Next slide, please, Danica. And so it's figuring out what we value as employees, what makes us tick. And these three things can be defined by the 3 C's. It's career, it's community, and it's cause. And for many of us, we grew up with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But I think that hierarchy really needs to be reassessed, renovated, if you will. These data come out of a survey with Facebook employees. And while it's specific to Facebook, I think the application is universal. So these are the 3 big buckets that we as workers, we as individuals, we as employees care about in our work. It's having a job that provides autonomy and allows us to use and leverage our strengths. And it's all about learning, too. We are learning creatures. And so to put a barrier between us and learning is a huge disincentive. The other thing that people care about is community. It's feeling respected and cared about. and where our accomplishments are recognized by our peers and fellow workers. And then the other thing that we care about is cause. It really is the mission of the organization. It's the vision. It's the impact that we're making as an organization in the world. These are the three things that we as humans care about in our work. Next slide, please, Danica. And so these three things can form a new type of psychological contract. Now, where these might not be spelled out explicitly, it's something that we inherently value, such that these really are the new expectations of employees and to some degree the obligations or the commitments that employers should be making. And what's interesting is all three matter equally. It used to be that an organization or employer could just focus on one of the three. But we're finding that in order to move individuals from low engagement to high engagement, all three need to be considered because all three are equally important. And also interesting in this research is that these three areas, these three buckets, they really don't differ by age or geography. There's been a lot of talk about millennials and what millennials value. But what's interesting is today we have roughly 5 generations actively working in the workplace. And as you look at these 3 core values, they matter as much to millennials as they do to baby boomers and everyone in between. There might be some slight difference in value, say with cause, relative to millennials and baby boomers, but it's not as much as you think. So the takeaway here is all 3 of these values matter, and they matter deeply. Next slide, please. So as we think about these 3 values, specifically career, where learning and continual learning is deeply valued by us, it's figuring out how we as employers, as managers, embrace learning as a core skill. And it's always thinking about what do people need in order to succeed at work. And it really is the ability to keep learning. We used to live in a time where what you learned was valuable for a number of years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But now we're in a time, because of rapid technological change and globalization, where what we learned could become obsolete within a few months. So this needs to be a focus, a renewed focus within organizations. But there's always the fear. There's always the fear that if we really invest in our employees and we train them, they're going to leave. And while that risk is while that point is really, really valid, I think the alternative is much better. And this quote comes from United Technologies, which is a large global conglomerate, and that is, we want people who are intellectually curious. It's better to train and have them leave than not to train and have them stay. And we're moving in a direction where companies are wholeheartedly embracing this notion of learning as a core skill, such that companies like Microsoft are appraising employees on their ability to learn from others within the organization and outside the organization, and how well they apply that knowledge. AT&T is doing something similar, slightly different, in that if employees are not showing a true desire to learn, continuous improvement in learning, then they are appraised negatively. And I suspect that we'll see more and more of this moving forward across all organizational sizes, small, mid, and large size. Next slide, please. So the question becomes, how do we keep our employees engaged and energized? And here are a few points. This is not an exhaustive list, and I won't go through each of these points. The ones that I've highlighted in bold might have more direct application to the three core values that we spoke about earlier: career, community, and cause. So it's creating an individual development plan. And with managers today, everyone is hard-pressed to find time, but at the end of the day, managers truly are coaches, they're mentors, and it's sitting down with direct reports with employees and having these discussions with them and understanding from them what they want to accomplish, but also empowering them to take control of their own professional development plans. We certainly, as managers and leaders, can remove barriers, but at the end of the day, that ownership must be theirs. But it's first finding out what that desire is so that we can remove barriers. And so we, as well as providing resources, because the day an employee comes on board with an organization, that employee is an investment within that organization. And so it's figuring out how we provide resources, how we outlay funding in order for that individual to grow, become more potential, which will ultimately benefit the organization's mission and vision. Next slide, please. So what do employers want? This is where I hope to segue between the marketplace, the workplace, and systems of higher education and providers of teaching and learning, the academic space. And what's interesting today is that we're seeing a disconnect between these two worlds. If you ask the chief academic officers within the academy how they're doing, many of them, the majority of them say, hey, we're doing a really, really good job with the graduates that we're producing and the skills that they bring with them. Employers differ in that assessment. They differ markedly. 40% of employers are having trouble finding workers with the skills they need. This was from a global survey by Manpower a few years ago. I think it's fair to say that we can do a better job, and when I say we, I certainly mean the employers on one side, the business world on one side, and the academy on the other. Next slide, please. And this is what an individual, actually he happened to be one of my former graduate professors, Peter Capelli at Wharton. We need to have a new model of teaching and learning where both sides of the equation are taking responsibility, because one way of looking at it or answering the question, what do employers want? Well, they don't want to have to train or retrain the employees that they're onboarding, their new hires. But it's not as simple as that. It's the business community and the academy getting together to figure out what is most important. Next slide, please. And the need is great, especially in this country, as we attempt to propel this country forward in the next generation, making sure that it is productive, that it continues to be an innovative space, not just nationally, but globally. It's going to come down to how well-trained and educated our rising generation is. Not just our rising generation, but also those that are currently in the workforce. You have roughly 37 million Americans with some college and no degree in Nevada. You have north of 300,000 Nevadans with some college and no degree. We, as a country, do a really good job sending students to college, but we fare rather poorly in terms of actually having those individuals complete that degree with an earned credential. Next slide, please. It's also taking into account that working learners are the majority of our students today within the higher ed space. These are individuals that are balancing work, life, family commitments, and it's figuring out how we as a higher ed industry can be much more supportive of this, not just shifting demographic, but it's also kind of a shifting mindset, if you will, from just a few decades ago where we would have traditional age students, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds being dropped off at the curb of their college or university by mom and dad, and then we'd see them 6 months later during a holiday break. That is no longer the majority. So it's figuring out how we deliver education in a much more conducive fashion. Next slide, please. And one of the big barriers today is that our educational system is time-based. It's very much a 20th century construct where we're measuring time spent in class rather than actually measuring the competencies that are gained. And in today's educational ecosystem, we're learning that individuals can acquire competencies anytime, anywhere, any place. But our system really is not designed for that. It's figuring out how to change that system. Next slide, please. I don't know how great your computer screens are right now, but if you can zoom in, this will give you a sense of this new educational ecosystem that we find ourselves in. It's much more of an educational flow. These curved lines, think of them as streams and rivers where the individual learner is stepping in the stream or the flow at some point in their work career and then stepping out. Time passes and then stepping back in. It's developing the educational industry to meet the needs of this new flow. And for that reason, I think moving forward, education will take on more of this arbitrage format where all of these educational platforms that exist today, it's figuring out how to make sure the type of learning that an individual needs and the type of training that an employer wants with that particular employee is validated and meets the needs of both parties. Next slide, please. And this gets us to a movement that is really gaining momentum in this country, and that is competency-based education, which is the realization that learners, everyone, learns at different rates depending on the subject matter. This is what Western Governors University is known for. It's what other institutions are becoming known for as well. While we served as the pioneer of this approach, more and more universities and colleges across this country are moving in this direction, and we certainly applaud that effort. The next slide, this visually just reinforces what I've tried to describe with how individuals learn at different rates. These are, think of this scenario as three students. Think of these numbered boxes as different subject matter, different topics. All of these individuals are taking the same one, but it could be that because of innate aptitude or what they've learned previously, student one in that first bar is able to demonstrate mastery at a much faster rate than student two, or student three for that matter. Moving forward, I think we'll see more and more educational providers and alternative potential providers moving in this direction. So I will stop there and take any questions.
Absolutely. And again, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to do so in the chat box in the bottom left corner of your screen. It looks like we do have a couple questions. So why aren't more colleges using this competency-based style of learning? It seems to make sense, especially for employees and employers who have busy lifestyles.
Great question. Higher ed, this should not surprise any of you, is not the fastest moving industry. And in many ways, we have over 900 years of history and tradition leaning against us. So things move at a much slower pace, but I'm encouraged, I'm optimistic, because over the last 2 or 3 decades, we have seen perhaps more movement in this direction than we've seen over the last 3 centuries. WGU was established in 1997 by 19 U.S. governors, and it was started for this reason. There are about 300 to 400 universities and colleges across this country, many of them well-known institutions that are in some form or fashion experimenting with competency-based education. So that suggests to me that we are moving in the right direction and that we will see more of this. And what's fascinating is that it's just not within the higher ed space, but we're also seeing this within the K-12 space as well.
And then is there a difference with costs for online schools versus brick and mortar schools?
Yes, the higher ed industry has a fair amount of variance when it comes to cost. Cost is a very complex topic. It can be a complex topic because as it relates to public institutions of higher education, they're subsidized to a great degree in order to bring down the out-of-pocket cost for their students. As it relates to WGU, I can speak specifically about that. I could speak generally, but we don't have enough time. With WGU, we have an interesting tuition model in that instead of charging per credit, which is how I went to college, there was a per credit cost. One would take 12 or 15 credits. You would multiply that. That would be your bill for that semester, plus books and other fees associated with that. At WGU, we have a flat tuition model in that you pay a flat fee. It includes everything, and that includes however many courses you can get through during that period of time. With this competency-based approach, one can accelerate through their coursework to the extent that they can demonstrate mastery. So as an example, a very tangible example, here in Nevada, the average time to a 4-year degree with us is 3 years. the fee itself is roughly, the annual fee is roughly $6,400. So if it's taking someone roughly 3 years to get through their program, it's about $16,000, which is a fairly good deal. On the graduate side, it's going to be less because those programs are typically 2-year or traditionally 2-year programs, but of course that's up to the learner.
And then the last question is why do you think that colleges don't have flat fees? I mean, that just seems like something that would be more widespread.
Yeah, great question. I see more experimentation taking place across the industry. You do have hybrid arrangements. These are called plateau tuition models where up to a certain credit amount, a student is charged on a per credit basis, but credits above that particular threshold would be in essence free. So the cost of taking 12 credits within this plateau model might be the same as taking 15 credits or 16 credits. It really serves as an incentive for students to take as much as they can in order to finish as quickly as they can. So it runs the gamut between per credit models to plateau models to what we refer to as a subscription-based model. I foresee moving forward that there'll be more experimentation within this space because much of the cost model is a function of federal financial aid, which can be a regulatory barrier for experimentation. But I see the U.S. Department of Education and others be much more open to experimentation in this space, especially when the outcomes are a lower cost degree and students are actually earning their degree within a shorter period of time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think that's all the time that we have for today. So I want to thank you so much, Spencer, for presenting today. We really appreciate it. I know that personally I found that incredibly informative. Definitely something to look into. So thank you so much again to Spencer, WGU Nevada, and if you want to get in touch with Spencer, please give the Chamber a call. We'd be more than happy to get you his information and to find out more about the school. And again, yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. There's no Chamber U next week. We're on spring break. So we hope to see you in 2 weeks, and I hope everybody has a nice break.
Thank you, Danica.
Thank you.